This is an interview with Humphrey Carver. The interviewer is LeGeyt. The date is November the 5th, 1993, and it's in his home in Rockcliffe Park in Ottawa. Good morning, Mr. Carver. Thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today. I appreciate being able to come and visit with you. And I guess maybe just to get started, you mentioned a minute ago that you were born in England. And could you tell me a little bit about your schooling that you did in England?
Well, I was born in the third of a family of 4 boys, right in the middle of England, just about as near to the middle as you can think of. And for that reason, I suppose, all these boys went to Rugby, which is a famous school that invented rugby football, and where Thomas Arnold was a famous headmaster and so on. But that's where I was at school, and that's a boarding school, of course, so you're away from home, and that's where I went between the ages of about 13 and 18.
And then where did you
And then I went to Oxford for 3 years, and I didn't make any great mark there, except that I could understand that I wanted to do architecture, and I went on to the Architectural Association in London, which is always known as the AA, not Alcoholics Anonymous, but Architectural Association, and it has a very famous school of architecture that I was at between 1924 and 1929. And so I lived in London for 5 years before I had finished being a student of architecture.
And at which point in 1929, then what did you do?
Then I realized that I wasn't going to get to know any rich women who would give me jobs, and I had a sort of itchy feet, and I decided that it would be a good idea to go to some part of the world where I didn't know anybody. And I deliberately chose to go to Canada because I didn't have any uncles and aunts and cousins and brothers. I didn't know anybody. In fact, when I thought of Toronto, I really thought it was in South America, but I found out that it was in Canada, and I arrived in Toronto on the 3rd of April, 1930. And I'd left behind all the people that I knew and all my friends in order to start off on my own and see what I could make of life.
And that was to Toronto that you came?
Yes.
Originally. And in Toronto, then, did you start an architectural practice?
No. I was just a kid, of course, though I was in the status of a student who completed his architectural training. But when I arrived in Toronto and I looked around for a job, on every architect's office was a little notice saying that they'd gone out for lunch. And the truth of the matter is, after a few days, I realized that going out for lunch meant you were going to have a lunch for several years, and they really never came back again. So my first few days in Canada contained quite a surprise that there was no architectural work. So I had to look for something else in life. And one day walking around near the City Hall, I saw a brass plate that said Wilson, Bunnell and Borgstrom, town planners and landscape architects. Landscape architects? I thought, that sounds exactly what I am. I've always loved landscape in the sense of the hills and valleys and villages of England, and I thought I'd like to see if I could be a landscape architect. So I went up the elevator and asked to see the member of this firm who was the landscape architect, and it was Carl Borgstrom, which is a Swedish name, and sure enough, he was there, sitting at his table as if he'd expected me. And within an hour, after much talk, he had hired me as his assistant in his landscape practice. And that's how I came to be a landscape architect. One day, I was suddenly converted from an architectural student to be a landscape architect. But I'd always known about gardens. I grew up with families who had big gardens and aunts and uncles who had gardens. So, in a sense, gardening was in my hands, and it wasn't a big jump to move from architecture to be a landscape architect. In fact, one of the people who taught me architecture became a very distinguished landscape architect, Geoffrey Jellicoe, and he and his friend Shepard were two teachers at the AAA, and so I grew up having in mind the great Italian gardens which Geoffrey and Jellicoe and Shepard had drawn in their beautiful book, and designing a garden was perhaps an ambition of mine. I would love to design a garden. I'd love to feel that I designed a landscape, whether that was a garden or not. I'm doing this to break the thing.
Okay. Well, but it's nice to listen to you talk about, because I didn't ask you who you had studied with, so it's nice to have you include those names. So when you then started with Carl Borgstrom.
Yes.
And what kind of, and that was in the 1930s, so it was a difficult time.
That was in 1930, yes.
What were some of the jobs?
Well, he was working in the Niagara Park system, and he had several park jobs in Hamilton, and he was also doing some gardens in Forest Hill, Toronto. And it was a mixed sort of practice. But the Depression, you realize, that I had arrived in seized this little firm of town planners and landscape architects. And by the next year, they really bottomed up, and I could see that I better not stay. I was an embarrassment to them as an employee they could let out, and I went off by myself to the West Coast to look at the mountains and sit out the summer with some cousins that I had who lived in British Columbia. We're probably getting too detailed here, aren't we?
No, that's okay. Now, that was what, 1931?
1931. Mm-hmm. And then I came back again in 1931 after the summer, and I met Carl Borgstrom, and he said, would you like to join with me in a partnership a 60-40% partnership and see if we can make it. At the same time, I got a letter from my brother who had gone to Africa and who was just going to build a school. And that was rather a temptation to go and join him. And at the same time, I met again the girl I loved, and we sat down together rather speechless, but she perhaps was the influence that made me decide to stay and join up with Carl Borgstrom and practice landscape architecture.
And she was from Canada then?
And she was a Canadian, and her name was Mary Gordon, and she came of a big Winnipeg family who were the children of Dr. C.W. Gordon, who wrote a book called The Sky Pilot, and Glengarry School Days. He was a very famous novelist of the period.
Isn't that interesting? So then you stayed in Toronto with Carl Borgstrom, yes. And for how many years was that? What years did you work with him?
Well, I worked with Carl Borgstrom really till 1939, 38. I started to pursue my other interests in planning, and I was invited to go to the School of Architecture and give the first lectures on town planning to the architectural students in the University of Toronto Architectural School. And I have a great interest in the social problems of society, and my interest in housing led me to join up with a group of people who were looking at the housing conditions in Toronto. Are we going to be...
It's okay, no, I can, that's fine.
And Carl Borgstrom and I slowly sort of drew apart because of my other interests, which didn't lessen my interest in landscape architecture, but made me realize that my interests went beyond landscape to the city itself and the planning of cities and the way people live in cities. And I became an urbanist rather than a landscape architect. But then, of course, the war came, and we were all cut off from our ordinary means of earning a living. And I, through the war, was with the Directorate of Personnel Selection as if I was a psychologist. That's what it was about. It was examining all the young men who went off to the war to see what was the right thing for them to do, other in a specialist sense, who would be the cooks and who would be the mechanics and who would be the electricians and who would drive trucks and who would ride motorbicycles. And I was in various military camps in Canada involved in this psychological sorting out of the young people going off to the war, and I became particularly the person who was interviewing officer candidates and deciding which ones, who should be officers. And at the end of the war, I was writing the history of psychology in the Canadian Army, and it had nothing whatever to do with landscape architecture or urban planning, except that I got to know Canadians. I got to know a whole generation of Canadians in a special way that you couldn't know them any better, because you'd sat with each man in a room by yourself and asked him the most embarrassing questions you could think of. And I feel I had a wonderful training about what makes Canadians tick and why they did what they did. I think I have to stop there because I get rather tired.
Okay. Maybe we can just go back.
You may have to leave all that out. I mean, it's got nothing to do with landscape architecture.
But I think it's critical that when you say that you've learned about Canadians in a way
yes.
that no other people have, I think that's very important.
I think that is an important point.
Yeah.
So I wandered off into a subject that perhaps should just be left out.
Well, I don't think so. What I would like to do, though, is just go back a few years.
Yeah.
When you said that you had gone to the West Coast and came back to Toronto and worked with Carl Borgstrom, that would have been about 1931.
Yes.
And the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and Town Planners was founded in 1934.
Right.
And so maybe you could...
yes, we have to go back to that, yes. Okay. I hadn't realized we'd moved right through, yes.
So maybe you could tell me kind of how did that all start? How did that happen? Were you all sitting around in a bar with
While I was working with Carl Borgstrom, I got to know some of the other people who were doing landscape architecture in Toronto. And in fact, a little group of us came to know one another so well, and we enjoyed meeting so much that we used to meet once a month for lunch at the Diet Kitchen on Bloor Street. It's a strange name for a restaurant. And it had a little garden out at the back of the house in which the restaurant was. And we talked about landscape architecture, and there were just 9 or 10 of us, and I could tell you all about all of them because I got to know them as amongst my closest friends. And finally, in 1934, in our discussion of who we were and what we would like to be doing if the Depression ever finished, we decided that we would like to form ourselves to be the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, and we hoped that our single most important purpose would be fulfilled, that we would get landscape architecture planted in every university in Canada, so there would be a proper way of people becoming landscape architects. And so I'd say that was a very good reason for calling ourselves the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, though in fact this little founding group only consisted of 9 people, and I can tell you who they all were and what was their interest in landscape architecture. Stop, because I'm breathless.
Okay.
Could I embark on the subject of the founders? I'm not quite sure whether you want all that or not.
Sure. If you feel, would you like to take a rest? Would you like to take a break, or?
Just leave me for a few, just to think out how I'm going to start on that. Right, I'll start. You press the button and start. I think it's interesting that this group of 9 people who had lunch together once a month on Bloor Street were a very mixed group, because the fact is landscape architecture came out of a very mixed background. There were the people who, since the medieval period, had moved around and advanced their knowledge of designing great parks and gardens for the great country houses of England and Europe and Italy and France, and they were the professionals, and they didn't call themselves landscape architects. They were designers of properties of the nobility and gentry, but they would say to the Duke or Lord so-and-so and to an eminent manor house owner, how would you like me to lay out your grounds? And I see up there on the hill a little woodland, and maybe we'd put a little, how would you like me to design a little Greek temple and call it the temple? And I think we should have an avenue of lime trees, and we should have a lake. You should have these things, and you'd be thought of as greater and grander than any other person who owned property. That was one kind of landscape architecture. At the other end of the scale was the Elizabethan garden that was usually designed by the wife of the owner of the property, and it was a little patterned area inside a picket fence outside the kitchen door, and that was another kind of beginning of landscape architecture. There were also people who grew trees in nurseries, and they would advertise that they could design an artistic garden. I'm saying that landscape architecture originated in a very mixed way with different large or small scope for garden and landscape design, and that's what the 9 people who met for lunch were like. They were people who had a very mixed experience, and of course there were at that time no schools you'd go to learn landscape architecture, and the leading person in the group was Dunnington Grubb, who was an Englishman who learned his landscape architecture in a classical way. In other words, he was like the people who back through the centuries had worked for the aristocracy in laying out their grounds. And stop. I've got lost. And in our group was little Helen Kippax, who was a small-scale person, and she designed small-scale gardens in the same sense as the Elizabethan housewives had made gardens outside the kitchen door. And she was a lovely person, and her practice in landscape architecture was like that. She would put in a few bushes and a few plants and a few flowering things, and some of them had fruit, like crab apples, and were connected with cooking, and she was an example of the smallest scale. And there was my own partner, Carl Borgstrom, who had a nursery to take trees from, and he had grown up in the country in Sweden, and he had become knowledgeable about gardens by walking all over Europe with a pack on his back and getting jobs in some of the great gardens of Europe and learning how to trim the hedges and how to prune the trees and how plants thrive in certain settings, in certain shade or sunny positions, and he understood the family needs of plants. They like cohabiting with certain plants, and they don't like cohabiting with other plants. And he was a countryman, and he'd grown up to learn where the bluebells grow in the woods and where the primroses grow and so on. And I think he was a very good landscape architect because he had it in his fingertips to appreciate the delicacies and sensitivities of trees and plants, just like a good school teacher understands the children and how they grow up. And then there was Gordon Cullen, who had started as a student in the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph, and he had gone on to Harvard School of Landscape Architecture and become a very distinguished student, and he worked with planners in developing the idea of the neighborhood unit. He worked with Thomas Adams, who was originally an English planner, who developed the regional plan of New York City. And Cullum moved on when he'd finished being a student, where he'd been involved in many very interesting research studies for Thomas Adams. He moved on to be in the firm of Olmsted, who had built Central Park and had developed a marvelous practice in all the great universities, both in the United States and in Canada, had work done by the Olmsted firm. And at the time that Cullen was with Olmsted, they were just going to build the great medieval museum in New York City called the Cloisters, and Cullen went to live in Spain for a year in order to find how they designed buildings on rocky settings, which was the setting of the Cloisters at the north end of Manhattan Island. And Cullum had left the Olmsted firm as the Depression set in, but he was another kind of person who had learned his landscape architecture in a great university at Harvard. Also from Harvard was Wilhelm Stenson, the son of the family of Stenson, who managed Dunnington Grubb's Sheridan Nurseries, which was started by the Dunnington Grubb and his wife, and they had brought the whole Stenson family from Denmark to manage and plant out the nursery, and the son became practically their adopted son because William Stenson went into Grubb's office as landscape architecture office, and Grubb sent him to learn architecture at the University of Toronto and then on to Harvard to learn to be a landscape architect. And I think of him as a very expert person in the the designing of gardens and the specifying of plants and the engineering aspects of the roads and water catchment areas. He was a true professional designer of the landscape. And I'm speaking about young Wilhelm Stenson, who was the shyest man I've ever met. I have to tell you also of another stream of history which leads into landscape architecture, and that is again, like the Elizabethan housewives who made their little gardens. Through the 19th century, there developed a new generation of very cultured women who knew about plants and who knew about the colors of flowers, and they discovered how to plant purple and yellow and orange and crimson into their gardens, as many new plants were found throughout the world. And one can think of the William Morris period when flowers appeared inside the house in the curtains and sofa coverings, and everything had to have a floral decoration. And this is a very 19th century period interest in gardens. And I think Mrs. Grubb, the wife of Dunnington Grubb, who had been, in fact, Laurie Dunnington, they joined their names together, she was a plants woman, an appreciator of flowers, and had a scholar's knowledge of plants rather than of designing gardens and designing landscapes. She was a plant person and a very scholarly one. So she represents another contribution to what is landscape architecture. I think I've said enough to show that this little group of founders were as mixed as landscape architecture is itself, all the way from large landscapes to the grouping of plants and trees. And I feel that is a very interesting way for our Canadian society to have started. I must say that in that group of people who met for lunch, I was the one person who had a particular interest in town planning, and it came out of my education at the AA in London and out of my interest in the social problems of a country, and I hoped very much that we could form a joint landscape architecture and town planning association. And in fact, when it was founded, the CSLA was called the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and Town Planners. And it seemed to me that it would be a wonderful thing for Canada to have an organization that made no distinction between planning cities and planning the landscapes in which cities grow, and this is a utopian thought that landscape architecture and city planning both have to do with making the earth receptive to human life. And you can't really separate urban life and life in the landscape. It's all the same problem, and that explains my interest in the landscape, which continued through my whole further professional life with Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which had to do with the building of the great cities that sprung up and multiplied and spread in the whole post-war period, and cities that didn't even exist at the end of the war became the great cities of Western Canada, and Toronto and Montreal doubled their population and grew out into the country. And if we'd been a bit better and had a Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and Town Planners all joined together, perhaps we would be able to show the rest of the world how to build cities. I have to stop there. Dunnington Grubb, who was certainly the leader and the aristocrat of landscape architects, and I've mentioned Helen Kippax, who I think of as an Elizabethan person, and I've mentioned Mrs. Grubb, who was, to my mind, a flower person, and I've mentioned Borgstrom. I'm counting them on my fingers. He didn't know it, but he was an ecologist because he understood about the relationships of plants and animals. Are we now on the tape?
Yes.
Yes. And I spoke about Cullum, who was originally, he'd been through an agricultural college, but he understood and worked with the great firms of planners, Thomas Adams, planning New York City, and Olmsted's firm, which was concerned with parks and the landscapes of the great institutions like universities. And he brought the Olmsted part of the practice with him back to Canada when the Depression set in. So he already had the clients of the Olmsted firm who were Havergal School, the University of Western Ontario, a little bit of the Niagara Parks, and so on. And who haven't I mentioned?
And then you talked about Stinson.
I talked about Stinson, so I did pretty well. And who did I? I didn't talk about Edwin Kay. Edwin Kay was a little different from the rest of us, who were rather tweedy, and Edwin Kay always wore a sort of a waistcoat and a city suit, and he had a moustache, and he had a watch chain across his tummy, and he had been in Europe as a manager of several big estates, I believe, and that is a part of landscape architecture, the management and the maintenance of growing things. You have to know how to topiarize the hedges and clip the grass and prune the trees. And I think of Edwin Kay as a prince amongst people who learnt their landscape architecture through the maintenance of landscapes, and he had the style of a businessman, and he was a businessman in his knowledge of landscape architecture. Who haven't I mentioned now?
Francis Steinhoff.
Yes. Francis Steinhoff was part of our little group. She had learnt garden design, I think, at Lothrop in the United States, which was a college for, I think, only women who learnt about plants and flowers and trees. And she left Toronto rather soon after we formed the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, so I didn't get to know her very well. But I will use her as a stream of people who have always been part of landscape architecture, and that is the non-professional people who are simply stunning as originators and makers of their own gardens. And there is something special about a garden made by a private person who never made anybody else's garden but their own, and yet it comes out with a personality that the professional can never quite reproduce. There is some personal connection between the interests of a person who might also be interested in books or in painting. And a garden is the way some people develop their artistic interests. So I think of Francis Steinhoff as a person who came to have a lovely garden in British Columbia, as there are such lovely gardens in Victoria, particularly. Yeah,
one of the things...
you might have to patch that in some way.
That's okay. One of the things when you mentioned that the group got together at the Diet Kitchen in Toronto, you said that the single purpose of getting together was to develop university courses in landscape architecture?
No, I didn't say it quite like that. Or if I did, I would have to. When a group of friends got to know one another, and we talked about what we were doing and so on. The idea of forming a Canadian Society of Landscape Architects was rather cheek. I mean, we didn't have any right in all of Canada. Why would a little group of people sitting around a table in this restaurant think that they, the idea I'm saying is, I think we did say that is what we would like to feel was the importance of our establishing ourselves as the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. It did have a serious purpose. I wouldn't say it's why we got together. It was simply one of the ideas that came out of our conversation, because we all came from different backgrounds, and there wasn't anybody who came from a Canadian background. We all had been in England or in the United States at Harvard, or we'd been at Lowthorpe, and the obvious curiosity of this group of landscape architects was that there wasn't any way you could become a landscape architect through a Canadian training. And that's what made us feel we were doing something. Yeah, this group having lunch, who had the temerity and the cheek to think that they could found the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, felt that they did have a serious purpose besides enjoying one another's company at lunch once a month. And so they discussed how wonderful it would be, since they all came from other countries. They came from the United States and from England and from Sweden and so on. How wonderful it would be if Canadian universities developed courses in landscape architecture, and what a marvelous outcome that would be of our friendship around the lunch table in Toronto. And it is an extraordinary thing that 50 years later, in 1984, when I went to the 50th anniversary assembly of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, though I was the only one of the 9 who survived, in fact, at that time, practically every university of great stature had a school of landscape architecture, and our hopes had been fulfilled. It was sad that all the 9 people were not present 50 years later to find that the humble little society that they had started in 1934, in fact, had blossomed like the roses, and there were a number of schools of landscape architecture.
Did you do anything in 1934? Did you take any direct steps to start a program?
No.
There wasn't anything specifically done to starting a university program?
It would have been a sort of futile thing to do in the middle of a depression. Everything was being cut in half, if not in quarters.
Mm-hmm. But you said that you taught at the University of Toronto.
Right.
That was in planning more than in
yes, it was in planning rather than in landscape.
What was
I think that Donington Grubb, in fact, did give a course of lectures in garden design at the University of Toronto to the same School of Architecture. But that's a different idea. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until after the war that any of the Canadian schools of landscape architecture appeared. That didn't happen until after the war. While I was in CMHC from 1949 to 1967, when I retired at the age of 65, I was known as chairman of the advisory group. And my principal responsibility was in funding, in using available funds that were written into the National Housing Act, research and education funds, and I was involved in setting up groups of people concerned, for instance, with the design of housing, and we founded the Canadian Housing Design Council. We also formed, right after the war, before I was with CMHC, but I continued to have the responsibility, the Community Planning Association, which was to help develop policies about cities extending their boundaries into the countryside, and obviously my principal interest was in this association standing for the idea of conserving open spaces and conserving the countryside the cities expanded into, which had been a very important part of the traditions of city planning in England while I grew up, when you realize that the first garden city was built in England the year I was born, and I was always interested in this subject. While I was with CMHC, I say my main responsibility was the administration of funds for education and research. And we formed several other organizations which were more directly concerned with urban research, and I always felt that the landscape was part of the subject of the government agency called Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that it was involved in the building and the extending of cities into the space around themselves to make a good living environment. And that's part of landscape architecture. I reflect that as soon as I had retired, I reverted to I picked up my interest in landscape architecture in a more direct way, because I retired in 1967, which was the year of Expo, when every municipality and city was required to have some sort of project to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Canada. And even the village I live in on the edge of Rockcliffe, on the edge of Ottawa, and it's called Rockcliffe Park, we had our own project, and I was very much involved in making what is now the village green in Rockcliffe Park. It took the form of salvaging an old piece of wasteland that was covered with glacier boulders, and therefore pretty well unusable, and gathering them into a circle and putting the two biggest boulders in the middle and thinking of the ages past where big stones had formed monuments like Stonehenge and Karnak in France. And that year I traveled with my children in England and Europe to see these monuments that were so mysterious in the past. And the village green in Ottawa is just a little example of the same sort of inspiration of monumental stones which are the size of, which are far larger than human beings. And in other ways, I have continued to be involved in the landscape of the place where I live. I designed another little park next to the village green, which we call the Jubilee Garden, as a place for conducting weddings and parties and festivals of various kinds, with or without music. It is a little place, a little piece of the village of Rockcliffe Park where people go to jubilate in various ways, and that's not why it's called Jubilee Garden. It's called Jubilee Garden because it was built in the Jubilee year of the Queen, but I like to think of it as being a place for jubilation, and it has sculptures in it which used to be the facade on the facade of the old Carnegie Library in Ottawa, and they've been thrown aside. They had been salvaged and thrown aside on the dump heap, and we brought them to make sculptures in this garden. I was also involved in the conservation of the edges of the little lake in the village of Rockcliffe Park, and we have successfully secured for the enjoyment of the people who live here the edge of the lake as a conservation area, meaning that it's a little bit of wild country with a pathway through it, instead of the edge of this beautiful little lake being alienated by having houses built along the edge of it, so that it would have become private property on the edge of the lake. It is, in fact, the village's own property. I think I've finished that.
What I would like to ask you is, you mentioned the village green and
Yes.
the Jubilee Park and the lake edge as three examples. What do you think was very Canadian about the design that was part of those? Do you think that, judging from your own background, you were trained in England, but you lived a long time in Canada, and of course, between this period and when you first came to Canada was when you said you learned about Canadians very well. What do you think is Canadian about the design of those three places?
Are we off the air?
No. Do you want to be off?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
One might ask, in what way are these three features of the village I live in, particularly Canadian, the two little parks, the Village Green, the Jubilee Park, and the conservation of the lake. Of course, we have tried to plant in the parks and along the edge of the lake solely Canadian indigenous plants. For instance, we prefer a Scottish pine that is indigenous to Canada. We prefer a pine that is not an Austrian pine, though the Austrian pine has long and beautiful needles. It isn't an indigenous tree. You realize that this village where I live used to be a forest of American elms. That's the high-roofed, the vase-shaped elm that has a very beautiful slender stem, a single trunk, and its leaves in the form of an umbrella, as it were. It's a very fine tree for making gardens underneath because it doesn't cut out the light. And we had beautiful gardens when the elm grew here, but all the elms have died of elm disease, and now we don't have an elm anywhere in this part of Canada. But I'm straying from the question. We are, by nature and by our interest, we are Canadian, and so we make a habitat for ourselves. We make our place where we live and the scenery we enjoy is Canadian, and we don't look at it as being especially different from any other landscape, but it is different. The special feature of this part of Canada is the cedars that can be clipped into cedar hedges, and the junipers that grow in the great open spaces around Ottawa, and the maples and the other deciduous trees, as well as the blue spruces. The spruces, I'm sorry, I'm lost. I've got to stop that.
Okay. What I think that what I'm hearing you say about this is that it's not so much a design concept that is Canadian, but it's the plant material.
Yes.
And how you use that plant material may be very similar to what was done in other countries, but when it comes to the Canadian scene, the design might be similar, but it's the plant material that's very special here.
Yes.
How does that plant material affect the design? Does it have an effect on the design?
Yes. The effect of our climate in Ottawa, I would say, is mostly that we have a very, very hot summer and a very cold winter. And it is not a climate very hospitable to herbaceous flowering plants. So the kind of plant that you find in an English garden and further south in the United States, with all the familiar blossoms and tall plants, isn't really worth growing here because the ground is baked by a very hot sun, and the temperatures are too high for sensitive plants in the summer and utterly too low in the winter. So there's a rather limited available supply of flowering plants that look well in an Ottawa garden, and hence our jubilation at the discovery of the flower known as impatiens, which is overused, but it is delightful, and we all enjoy it and overuse it. We should be more original in our discovery of flowering plants. In Canada, in Canadian cities, a very large proportion of the population, all the established families who might have gardens, do possess cottages on the thousands of lakes that we're very fortunate to have in Canada. And so there's not much point in planting herbaceous flowering species that are going to flower in the summer when you're up at the cottage. It's just a nuisance to have to look after them, and what's at the cottage is absolutely stunningly beautiful, a water garden rather than a flower garden.
Very true.
If I ask myself, what have I done for landscape architecture rather than what I have done to live in a beautiful place through the year and where I go in Nova Scotia for the summer, I'd like to say I'm very, very proud to have been amongst the founders of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, and I rather wish I had made that my career, except that I have found a wider context into which to put landscape architecture, and I think I have played a part in founding the Town Planning Institute in the post-war period when there wasn't any Town Planning Institute, and I was there, as it were, when it started, and I've been president of the Town Planning Institute. In my retirement, I would like to think of that I have played a very active part in where I live, in the suburban area where I live, where I've been on every committee that you could think of, and I designed the village green and the Jubilee Garden and battled for the conservation of our little lake, which is the most delicious landscape feature of this village. And I hope also that by making my summer family settlement in Nova Scotia, where we acquired a considerable length of the seashore, about 1.5 miles of seashore. I have been involved in purchasing it, and in that sense, protecting it because it is available for anybody to go and enjoy it like I do. And I think the conservation of the shore of the two east and west sides of coasts of Canada are amongst the most important landscape conservations that could be accomplished, and I hope that will continue beyond what's already been acquired by provinces and the federal government and private owners too. And I've taken a part in the private owner idea of conservation of the seashore. That's all.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe for a final question, what I would like to ask you is to perhaps do a little crystal ball gazing and ask you what you feel the future role perhaps of landscape architecture in Canada could be, or the future role of landscape architects. How do you see that they could function in the future?
So are we on now? Right. I think landscape architects are going to remain as different and varied in their special contributions as they were in the first place. There are going to be people, landscape architects, who create public recreation places, parks, and so on. There are going to be people who design gardens like an artist paints a picture. A small garden can be the most beautiful thing I can imagine. It doesn't have to be big, and it doesn't have to be expensive. So the art of landscape architecture and the interest of landscape architects in conserving and developing with indigenous woodlands enormous tracts of Canadian landscape are very different objectives of individual specialists in the landscape profession. I think that those people in all their varieties are going to make important contributions, but I hope that they will be part of the source of a philosophy about how we live in this marvelous country, in the sense of, do we have enormous, violent, and break your heart cities that are so overpopulated and dense, or do we gradually discover a way of dispersing our settlements, particularly now that the mechanical means of communication through computers and so on has made it possible for people to be much more spread out than we thought at the beginning of this century 100 years ago. Now you can live in a little village by the sea and participate in great industries and great corporate organizations at your desk, looking out onto green fields and gardens. And I think that the background of possibility of changing the way we live in a country is going to offer options which landscape architects can conceive and help to build. And in the next few centuries, I wouldn't be surprised if some of our big cities are thought of as obsolete and old-fashioned, and many more people are living in our great open spaces enjoying the works of landscape architects.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed having a chance to chat with you this morning.
You're winding up now.
Well,
I think you asked very good questions, some of which I can't answer.